A San Diego car salesman is murdered while enjoying a quiet evening with his family. Two killers vanish without a trace. Years pass and there are no arrests. Local authorities turn to a federal prosecutor for help. He launches an aggressive investigation that uncovers two conspiracies. One to commit murder, the other to conceal the crime. When a high-profile homicide investigation turns cold, detectives turn to a tough federal prosecutor for help. For over a decade, Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Burns spearheaded investigations and fought for justice in the courts of Southern California.
My philosophy was always to be fair, but to be aggressive. In many cases, particularly in the latter parts of my career as a prosecutor, I was dealing with people that had made a career out of committing crime. And the objective in those cases was to convict the person of the latest offense. And in most of the cases, it was to incapacitate the person for the longest possible period of time so they couldn't come out and commit new crimes and have additional victims.
In this episode, the names of some individuals associated with the case have been changed to protect their identities. In San Diego County, in the town of Carlsbad in the late 1980s, 58-year-old Salvatore Retti had been making a living selling cars for almost 30 years. He had a reputation for honesty and integrity. He was well liked by customers. Fellow salesmen thought of him as a mentor. He was a former Milwaukee police officer and a former minor league baseball player. After decades of selling cars for dealerships, Sal was looking forward to opening his own used car lot. September 17th, 1988. Sal Retti was relaxing in his home in Leucadia, California, just outside of San Diego. He was watching television with his wife, daughter, and grandchildren. There was a knock at the front door. His wife, Barbara, answered the door and was greeted by two men. One of them asked to speak with her husband. Barbara told Sal that someone was at the door to see him.
The source of their power?
Can I help you?
Moments later, gunshots rang out. Barbara found her husband lying on the floor. She called 911.
1 Adam 31, 1 boy 31, 10-6. What's your emergency?
The San Diego police responded to the call. Moments later, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics found Sal Retti lying unconscious on the floor, the victim of 3 gunshot wounds. Medics worked desperately to save his life. 15 minutes later, Sal Retti was pronounced dead. The San Diego homicide detectives arrived at the Retti home. The 3-man team began to process the crime scene. One investigator interviewed the victim's wife, Barbara. She described the 2 men who knocked at the door.
The other
She
one
said it was not uncommon for
was
strangers
quite
to
tall
visit the
and
house to talk to
thin.
her husband about buying and selling cars. Another investigator interviewed neighbors. One man said he saw two men run from the house and drive away in a dark-colored sedan with its lights off. Near the front door, investigators found 4 bullet casings. Homicide detective Terry Wisniewski was on the scene.
Even though it was dark at the time, our flashlights hit and you could see expended shell casings on the deck. It appeared to be 9mm shell casings. They were identified by the camera deputy and photographed.
Barbara Rossetti was asked if she knew why anyone might want to kill her husband. She immediately told investigators that her husband was organizing a lawsuit against one of the car dealerships he had worked for. Sal believed the dealership had systematically cheated him and other salesmen on their commissions. Commissions are based on the amount of profit made on a vehicle. Sal was convinced the dealership understated profit margins so it could pay less commission. The suit began with 17 salesmen. But through Sal's efforts, 300 others over a period of 5 years ultimately joined the suit. With so many plaintiffs, the lawsuit could potentially cost the dealership millions of dollars. Barbara Rossetti also described attempts to persuade her husband to drop the suit.
There was one night when Sal...
Mrs. Rossetti also told us that night that he received an anonymous phone call about 2 weeks prior to the homicide. And in that phone call, he was offered to be sponsored for his own dealership if he would drop out of the lawsuit.
That I really know.
Barbara also described another call, this one more ominous.
Got a strange phone call.
Sal was told a car would be sent that night to pick him up and take him to meet someone to discuss settling the lawsuit. But Sal was suspicious and declined to take the meeting. Investigators went to the dealership named in the lawsuit. They were told that the dealership had recently been sold. They learned that the purchase agreement contained a clause that indemnified the new owners against Sal Rossetti's lawsuit because the alleged fraud had taken place before the change of ownership. Detectives learned that the previous owners were Ralph and Lula Mae Osborne.
Excuse me, Miss Osborne?
Investigators visited the Osbornes at their home. Mrs. Osborne said that during their ownership, she and her husband had little to do with the daily operations of the dealership. She told detectives to speak to the former manager, her son, Will Nix.
Hi, folks. I'm Will Nix. Here at Will Nix Auto, we can put you in a brand new car no matter what.
Will Nix now had his own successful
We've got
dealership.
pickups, T-Birds, Escorts, and the incredible 1988.
Will Nix sold more cars in Southern California than any other dealership.
$200 a month. So come on down to Will Nix Auto. Do right by you, and we'll get you cruising in style.
Detectives knew that if Sal Rossetti's lawsuit was successful, it could bankrupt Nix's retired parents. That was enough to give Will Nix a motive for murder and make him a suspect. However, investigators avoided questioning him directly.
Anytime we start to talk to someone that we feel is a suspect in the investigation, we want to know as much as possible about that person and what kind of answers we'd get from him before we even start talking with him.
People who knew Will Nix or were close to him were interviewed, including Nix's assistant manager, Joseph Smith. Smith said he knew nothing about the murder and had never heard Nix make any threatening statements about Sal Rossetti. Smith explained that on the night of the murder, Will Nix took delivery of a brand new Harley Davidson. Nix even had a small party to commemorate the purchase. Based on what Smith told investigators, it seemed Nix had a verifiable alibi. Detectives spent months interviewing dozens of people who knew Will Nix. No one said they were aware of any animosity between the men. No one provided any information about the murder. Several people flat out refused to speak to detectives.
And we were running into a lot of closed doors. People were frightened over the death of Salvatore Retti. People were nervous about the lawsuit. People just were reluctant to talk to us, and some people were actually didn't want to talk to us because they were hiding things regarding their knowledge of the homicide.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required.
The lack of cooperation prevented detectives from gathering any evidence against Will Nix. Despite the efforts of detectives, a year passed with no arrest in the murder of Sal Retti. Although investigators had a suspect with a motive for murder, it wasn't enough. They needed evidence to arm prosecutors in a court of law. First, they would have to break through the wall of silence that surrounded their only suspect. The San Diego Sheriff's Department had spent over a year trying to solve the murder of Sal Retti. Dozens of leads had gone cold, and although the case was still active, investigators began to wonder if they would ever solve the crime. They got their break when a man contacted the police and said he had information about the murder. His name was Eugene Coburn. He was a sales manager at Will Nix Ford. His daughter had dated Will Nix off and on for years.
Mr. Nix is...
He explained that he hadn't come forward earlier because he feared for his safety and did not want to lose his job. But after a year, his conscience got the better of him. Coburn said it was widely known among Nix's friends that Nix hired Mexican hitmen to murder Sal Retti. Nix also allegedly planned the murder in front of several witnesses. When pressed for proof or evidence, Coburn admitted that he had none. It was all hearsay. Investigators needed to corroborate Coburn's story, but with Will Nix still at liberty, investigators were not surprised that none of his associates would admit to hearing anything about a murder plot.
I don't know anything about the murder.
Terry Wisniewski realized he needed help. He had worked on a previous case with Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Burns. He told Burns about the Retti case and the information that Coburn had given. Burns agreed to take the case.
One of the first pieces of information that Gene Coburn had told the sheriff's detectives was that he had heard through people closely associated with Mr. Nix that the shooter in this case had been recruited from Mexico. And that was an important revelation for us. It was important, first of all, because it gave the federal government a right to be involved.
One of the killers was suspected of crossing the border into the United States from Mexico, where he was believed to have returned after the shooting. Because of the border crossing, the FBI was able to assist in the investigation. Prosecutor Burns and the FBI agents needed to find a way to compel witnesses to reveal what they knew about the murder. They developed a plan that would use the power of a federal grand jury to crack the silence of the witnesses.
The grand jury has the power to compel a person to appear in front of it and to answer questions put. The detectives don't have similar power. they can pursue leads and they can point toward evidence, but ultimately, if, as in this case, the witnesses are unwilling to talk to the police, then they're really stymied, and there's not too many ways for them to go. That's not true with the grand jury. The grand jury can pull people in. If they refuse to answer the questions, they can be put in jail for contempt. They can be held for the life of the grand jury, which in federal court is 18 months. And that kind of compulsion frequently loosens witnesses' tongues.
For Burns's plan to work, he would need the help of the one cooperating witness he had, Eugene Coburn.
We, in the course of the investigation, had him make a number of monitored telephone calls where the monitoring equipment was set up. The agents and I had earphones where we could listen to the conversation.
The plan was to have Coburn call people who might have knowledge about Nix's involvement in the murder. The conversations were tape recorded. During the calls, Coburn would say that he'd been subpoenaed by a grand jury and he didn't know why. He would say he saw Nix's name on the subpoena and wondered what he should or shouldn't tell the grand jury.
What should I do?
One of the first calls that was made by Mr. Coburn at the behest of the investigators was to a person by the name of Jim Walczak. Walczak was in Nix's inner circle at Will Nix Ford. He was one of the sales managers there. And as it turned out, Walczak had heard Nix talking about having Mr. Russetti killed, knew that there was planning going on.
With the incriminating statements on tape, the investigators now had evidence that the person had knowledge of the murder.
In many instances, these witnesses were called before the grand jury, and they began before the grand jury, as the trial testimony later revealed, by telling the grand jury that they had no information about the case and they didn't know why they were subpoenaed. And I would let them essentially paint themselves into a corner before the grand jury before I would produce the tape recorder out in the open and play the tape and ask them to listen to their own voice on the tape.
To play a tape for this hearing.
When Walczak denied knowing about the murder, Burns played the tape of his phone conversation.
The possibility of
Burns then explained the laws concerning perjury.
and the repercussions they may play on you today.
There's a provision of federal law that applies to grand juries, and that provision of federal law says essentially this, that it is a defense to a perjury charge if during a continuous session of a grand jury, although you've made a false statement as a witness, you correct that statement before you leave the grand jury chamber. And I would explain that in detail to each of the witnesses.
Faced with the threat of punishment for perjury, most reluctant witnesses changed their stories and cooperated with the grand jury investigation. FBI agent Jacob Gregory participated in the recording of the phone conversations.
When we joined forces with the sheriff's office, we interviewed a variety of people and quickly discovered that many of the people did not want to talk, but we had suspicions that people knew more than what they were saying, and in a collaborative effort with the sheriff's office and meeting with the prosecutor, Mr. Burns, we decided that we would attempt to get a couple of the witnesses to record some conversations. And we did that, recording phone calls between some witnesses. And that produced a little bit more information.
With each witness who testified before the grand jury,
John, this is
the
James.
phone technique was repeated.
Hey, I just got a subpoena to be...
Witnesses were persuaded to make calls to a new round of potential witnesses.
We knew people were being underhanded and dishonest and were trying to keep information from us, and that the only way we were going to get the information was to sucker them into telling us about it. I don't mean anything that exceeded bounds of ethics, but a lot of these people were tricked, essentially tricked into telling us what they knew.
Ultimately, they netted Will Nix's assistant manager, Joseph Smith. After lying twice to the grand jury, Smith was confronted with evidence that implicated him in the murder.
Just calm down.
He eventually agreed to call Will Nix.
The assistant dealership manager was a gopher for Will Nix. But essentially, he ran personal errands for Nix. He became very involved in the conspiracy and the plot to cover up the murder afterwards.
On June 12, 1990, investigators recorded a phone conversation between Nix and Joseph Smith. Nix was aware of the grand jury investigation. He believed his phone lines were being tapped, although law enforcement never attempted to do so. But Nix's paranoia kept him from saying anything that would implicate him in the murder. Marlene Cavan, Nix's assistant body shop manager, testified at the grand jury hearings. Cavan said that Nix asked his employee Paul Gonzalez to arrange the murder of Rossetti. FBI agent Russ Baker investigated the Gonzalez connection.
Will Nix liked to pretend he was a real tough guy and liked to associate with other people he believed were tough guys. So Paul portrayed this image at the dealership. Paul made hints that he was associated with Mexican mafia, that he knew drug dealers and lots of dangerous people, and that Paul was not a person to be messed with either, that he was a dangerous person. Paul was actually not a tough guy. He was just playing this image. Will Nix eventually started to call on Paul's help in situations, and Paul had to start producing. The first time, Will Nix wanted to buy some Uzi submachine guns. He'd seen the movie Scarface, and he thought that was just a great movie, and he wanted to have some Uzi submachine guns to defend his home. And he thought that Paul, being an underworld figure, would be able to get these machine guns for him. Now at the time, those machine guns were easily bought at any store, and Paul Gonzalez went and bought the Uzis at a local gun show and gave them to Will Nix. But Will Nix gave him the job because he thought he was an underworld figure and could produce for him.
According to the witness, Will Nix approached Gonzalez and asked if he would murder Sal Rossetti. Gonzalez declined to commit the murder himself, but offered to have it done by professional hitmen. Nix's assistant manager, Joseph Smith, told investigators how the murder was financed. According to Smith, Nix had a cocaine problem and was supplied on an almost daily basis by drug dealer David Hernandez. Hernandez had supplied Nix with drugs for the past 3 years, delivering a total of $30,000 worth of cocaine. Nix asked Hernandez for a $10,000 loan, but did not tell him what it was for. Nix knew that the borrowed cash would be difficult for investigators to trace. Hernandez agreed to provide the loan. Gates was asked to pick up the money from Hernandez. Nix later told Gates that the money was being given to Paul Gonzalez so he could hire hitmen to kill Sal Rossetti. The FBI and Sheriff's Department now had enough evidence to make a move to arrest Will Nix and bring him to justice. On May 10, 1991, nearly 3 years after Sal Rossetti was gunned down, FBI agents arrested Will Nix.
Yes.
He was charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder, with a special circumstance of murder for financial gain. He was also charged with using a firearm in the commission of a crime. When agents searched Nix's home, they found several firearms, including an Uzi with a laser sight. The guns, however, were all legally registered. Nix was taken to the Metropolitan Correction Center to await trial.
He was a cocaine user. He was a drug user. He appeared to have a sizable ego, and he was the type of person who wanted things right away, and when things didn't go his way, he got upset. And he's the type of man who felt threatened by this lawsuit against his mother brought by Salvatore Retti, and decided that the best way to handle that was to execute him.
Nix's employee Paul Gonzalez was arrested shortly afterwards and was also charged with murder. Gonzalez waived his Miranda rights and agreed to take a polygraph exam. He denied knowing anything about a plan to murder Retti. But the polygraph exam indicated that Gonzalez was lying. Gonzalez was given a final chance to cooperate. In exchange, a judge might consider a lighter sentence.
No, I don't.
Faced with overwhelming evidence against him, Gonzalez relented. He explained that he offered his son-in-law, Albert Vargas, $2,000 to drive the car on the night of the killing. Special Agent Russ Baker.
Vargas offered to do the killing himself for the $10,000. Gonzalez refused as he didn't want his son-in-law to actually shoot someone. In Gonzalez's mind, there was a difference between arranging a murder and actually pulling the trigger yourself. He did not want his son-in-law to be the shooter. Vargas was insistent that he wanted the money.
Eventually, Gonzalez managed to get in touch with a man named Jose Miranda. Miranda's nickname was Tonto. He was a Mexican national who claimed to have committed several contract killings. Finally, Gonzalez recruited his son, Paul Jr., to drive a second car that would be exchanged with the killer's car after the crime. Gonzalez went on to tell investigators that shortly before the murder, Will Nix instructed his personal mechanic to prepare a car that the hitmen could use for the job. He gave the car a tune-up and replaced the license plates with temporary tags which would be difficult for an eyewitness to identify. November 21st, 1991. Gonzalez Sr. and Vargas appeared in U.S. District Court and entered guilty pleas. The same day, Paul Gonzalez Jr. pled guilty in federal court to conspiracy to commit murder for hire. They all agreed to testify in hopes that their cooperation would result in lighter sentences. Jose Tonto Miranda, the suspected shooter, was nowhere to be found. Investigators believed he was hiding in Mexico.
We were told by Paul Gonzalez that this person we came to know as Tonto, the shooter in the case. His true name was Jose Miranda. We tried to verify to the extent we could the identity of this person. The federal agents contacted the postal delivery man at the address that we were given for Jose Miranda, and that person confirmed to the agents that mail had been delivered to that address, addressed to a Jose Miranda. We learned from Paul Gonzalez that shortly after the killing, Jose Miranda went back to Mexico. And when the indictment was issued and the warrant was issued as a result of that indictment, that warrant was given over to Interpol, and it remains active, I'm told, to this day.
The U.S. Border Patrol was alerted to the warrant for the arrest of Jose Miranda. The International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol, was also notified in the hope that Miranda might be apprehended and sent back to the United States for trial. As Larry Burns prepared for trial, he feared that the jury would not believe his key witnesses.
The big problem with this case was the credibility of many of our witnesses. I mean, we had self-confessed murderers testifying for us. Albert Vargas had agreed for a sum of money to go to the door and kill a person that he'd never met before. Paul Gonzalez, seeking advancement within an auto dealership, had willingly involved himself in a murder.
Many witnesses had also lied under oath to a grand jury not once, but twice before.
Mr. Burns, what are the charges in this case?
Mr. Gonzalez?
With such dubious witnesses, prosecutors knew it would not be easy to win their case. The trial of Will Nix began on July 16th at Vista Superior Court. The Honorable J. Morgan Lester presided. One of the first witnesses who testified was James Walczak, Nix's sales manager.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
He testified that Nix was upset about the impact the lawsuit was having on his mother, and he was worried about a similar lawsuit that might be brought against his own dealership. Walczak also testified about Nix's aggressive personality. Nix liked to refer to himself as the Bull.
Did he ever evoke his nickname, the Bull, to you in some fashion?
Yes, he said, you mess with the bull, you get the horn.
You get the horn.
You get the horn, right.
In the meeting, he said Nix discussed shooting Sal
When
Rossetti.
Nix would relate to you the effect that the Rossetti lawsuit was having on his mother, what was his demeanor?
In its cross-examination, the defense established that Walczak and the Rossetti family had been friendly for many years. The defense attempted to show that Walczak did not take Nix's death threats seriously by asking him if he ever told Sal about them.
And you said nothing.
No, I didn't.
There were witnesses we called who said, look, I knew this was going on. I heard Will Nix talk about offing this guy, having him done. And the obvious follow-up question was, when did you first report it to the authorities? Did you go home that night? Did you try to make an anonymous call to the police to tell them that this thing was afoot? And of course, the response from each of these witnesses was, no, I did nothing. I did nothing. I did nothing either to preserve my position at Will Nix Ford, or because I didn't want to get involved, or because I thought it wouldn't be in my interest, for one reason or another, to bring this to the attention of the authorities. That's hard for people to accept. It's hard for people to accept that someone can be so greedy or so selfish that they wouldn't alert authorities to an impending murder.
I didn't say anything.
The defense argued that any verbal threats Nix had made about Rossetti could be attributed to Nix's everyday temper and drug problem. Joseph Smith, Will Nix's assistant manager, was the first of the co-conspirators to testify for the prosecution. Smith said he learned of Nix's plans to murder Sal Rossetti days before the crime took place. He admitted picking up the money from Nix's drug dealer. Smith testified that he was upset when he learned that the money was being used to pay hitmen to kill Sal Rossetti. Because he did not report the murder plot to authorities, Smith was charged with murder. On cross-examination, the defense attacked Smith's credibility. Smith admitted that he had perjured himself repeatedly during the grand jury hearings.
You told the grand jury that you didn't know Mr. Nix had arranged anything. Was that the truth or a lie?
A lie.
And the second time you testified, you've been granted immunity. You were lying even though you had immunity?
Yes.
A prosecution then called Will Nix's drug dealer, David Hernandez.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
He testified that a month before the murder, he loaned Nix $10,000. At the time, Hernandez claimed he did not know what the money would be used for. Then he was served a subpoena to appear before the grand jury. A day before his scheduled appearance, Hernandez said he spoke to Will Nix.
I got a subpoena.
Hernandez said Nix instructed him on what to tell the grand jury.
By the grand jury. You could ask about murder for hire.
When did Mr. Nix tell you to tell the grand jury that that money was for a football bet?
It was that same day, there in the parking lot.
And what were his instructions to you regarding your testimony before the grand jury, before you first appeared on the grand jury?
He said to say that it was for a football bet.
In order to pay for this hit, Mr. Nix borrowed cash from a person that he'd had a long relationship with and that he'd bought his drugs from. When that individual was first called before the grand jury, he disclosed to the grand jury that he had loaned Mr. Nix $10,000 around the time of Mr. Rossetti's murder. But he ascribed the debt as a sports bet, that Mr. Nix had gotten in a jam, had made a bad sports bet, and had to pay off. When Mr. Hernandez, David Hernandez, came back before the grand jury several months later, he admitted that that was a lie, that Mr. Nix had told him to tell that story, to give that reason for borrowing the money.
Hernandez also said that Will Nix had offered to supply a lawyer to accompany him to the hearing. Hernandez declined the offer. Now it was time for the prosecution to present the centerpiece of its argument. Paul Gonzalez Sr., the man who admitted to arranging the murder of Sal Rossetti.
You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
Gonzalez testified that the original plan was to murder Sal Rossetti at the car dealership where he worked. The public shooting would be a warning to other salesmen to drop the lawsuit against Will Nix's parents. But when he and the hitman arrived at the dealership, Sal was not there. Gonzalez testified that he, his son, Albert Vargas, and Jose Miranda stopped at a nearby payphone to call Will Nix. Nix provided directions to Sal Rossetti's home. Gonzalez told the court that he wanted to abort the plan. But Nix insisted on going forward because an alibi had already been arranged for that day, the purchase of the new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Gonzalez also testified that Jose Miranda insisted on doing the job because he wanted to get paid. Eventually, Gonzalez said he gave in to the others, and the plan to murder Sal Rossetti at his home was back on. In its cross-examination, the defense attempted to prove their main argument in Will Nix's defense, that Gonzalez murdered Rossetti without Nix's knowledge as a way to gain entry to Nix's inner circle. The defense claimed that Nix was unaware that Gonzalez had arranged for the murder of Sal Rossetti, and that Gonzalez had lied about Nix's involvement to save himself. Albert Vargas was Paul Gonzalez's son-in-law. He offered to drive the hitman for $2,000. Vargas's testimony was critical because he was with the alleged shooter, Jose Miranda, at the time of the murder.
Vargas, will you tell us what happened once you got out of the car?
Well, we walked right up to the door.
Vargas testified that he and Miranda drove to Sal Rossetti's house. He wore a baseball cap to hide his long hair. He said Barbara Rossetti answered the door.
You've been waiting long.
Sal home.
Yes, just a minute.
And she called her husband. A few seconds later, Sal came to the door. Vargas said he told Miranda that the man at the door was the target. Then Miranda started firing. Now it was the defense's turn to present its case, and the defendant himself would take the stand. Will Nix was a master salesman, a smooth talker who made millions selling cars. By taking the stand, he would begin the most important sales pitch of his life, trying to sell a jury on his innocence. The prosecution used the testimony of 16 witnesses to detail the plan to murder Sal Rossetti and the conspiracy to cover it up. After 4 days of testimony, the prosecution rested. The prosecution expected that Will Nix would take the stand in his own defense.
As I prepared for the trial of Mr. Nix, I realized that the biggest obstacle that I had to overcome was Mr. Nix's personality. He was a likable fellow. I mean, despite all the excesses in his life, he was bright, he was articulate, he was very, very glib, and he was very persuasive.
So help you God?
Yes.
The defense called Will Nix to the stand. His attorney would attempt to show that Paul Gonzalez murdered Sal Rossetti without Nix's knowledge or consent. Gonzalez was portrayed as a hanger-on, a wannabe willing to do anything to share Will Nix's fast-living lifestyle. Nix said Gonzalez would sometimes bring his son to his home. Gonzalez allegedly told his son that they would one day have a similar home. Will Nix testified about the day after Sal Rossetti's murder. Paul Gonzalez allegedly turned up at Nix's home with surprising news.
He said, I took care of that salesman, Sal, the one that's been bothering you and your folks.
Did you make any other comments to him when he said this to you?
Nix testified that he was dumbfounded by Gonzalez's news, that he didn't believe Gonzalez at the
I
time.
know you didn't, but your family was in danger.
Had you had any discussions prior to that point with Mr. Gonzalez about doing harm to Mr. Rossetti?
No, sir, not at all.
The defense alleged Gonzalez showed up in Nix's office 2 days later. Gonzalez allegedly expected to be rewarded with a promotion for killing Rossetti.
He came in, he said, hey, amigo, I took care of your problem for you. Now when do I get to take over the body shop?
Nix said he refused to put Gonzalez in charge of the body shop.
I said, Paul.
According to Nix, Gonzalez reacted angrily.
Did you ever discuss calling the other authorities or anything like that with Mr. Gonzalez?
He just said,
Nix alleged that he didn't notify police because Gonzalez had threatened him.
And he said, before he went out the door, if any word of this ever gets out, or if I'm ever arrested or picked up in any way, shape, or form, then I'm going to make sure that you live long enough to bury your father and your 2 children.
Prosecutor Burns was concerned that Nix's testimony might carry weight with the jury.
I remember one point him telling the jury that although he thought he ran his dealership, that it was really his mother that was involved, and if they had to tell anyone truthfully who was really the brains behind the outfit, it was his mother. And that kind of self-deprecating humor was well received by the jury. I remember looking over and watching some of the jurors chuckle and think, boy, they're making a connection with this guy, and that's bad for us, because if they believe what he has to say, we lose.
He's dead. Paul would kill him.
Next, the prosecution would get their opportunity to cross-examine Will Nix. For Larry Burns, it would be his final chance to expose Will Nix to the jury as the man who orchestrated the murder of Sal Rossetti. Successful car dealer Will Nix was standing trial for the 1988 murder of Sal Rossetti. Because he had taken the stand in his own defense, the prosecution now had their chance to cross-examine him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Burns would attempt to use Nix's testimony against him. According to Nix's story, Paul Gonzalez's death threats were made 2 days after Gonzalez told him he had killed Rossetti. The prosecution claimed that Nix had plenty of time to notify authorities.
Mr. Nix, would you explain to this court why you didn't pick up the phone and report Paul Gonzalez on the spot.
Because I didn't believe him.
The taped phone calls the prosecution made during the investigation played an important role in bringing Nix to trial. But no tape recording damaged Nix's defense more than the one in which he blatantly lied to his mother during a prison phone conversation.
Do you remember this conversation?
At one point, his mother called him at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, and she was beside herself. She said, "What's this all about? I mean, how is it that you're in jail for this? I don't understand." And in a very emotionally laden, plaintive voice, he told her, "I have no idea. If you think you're confused, imagine me. I mean, the FBI shows up at my house and haul me off to San Diego, and here I am sitting in a jail cell scratching my head of how I've been implicated in this thing."
I don't know what Paul is.
On the tape recording, the jury heard Nix tell his mother that he didn't know why Paul Gonzalez had been arrested. The jury, however, had heard Nix testify that Gonzalez told him he killed Rossetti.
I said, "Mr. Nix, I want to ask you about what you said to your mother. But before I ask you about that, I want to ask you about the way that you said it. I got to confess to you, Mr. Nix, I listened to this tape, and I listened to your tone of voice, and I was left scratching my head. I really believed you. You sounded like you spoke with great conviction here. Did you anticipate that your mother was going to ask you about this? I mean, did you practice modulating your voice so that you could sound as persuasive as you did?" And of course he had to answer no, that the facility to lie like that, to lie spontaneously and to be very convincing in his lies, came to him, and that it was instinctive with him that he could do that. And it was through that type of examination that I think I was able to convince the jury that the image of Will Nix that they saw in court was very different, that this was a chameleon type fellow that could put on a face that was very different than the true Will Nix.
After the closing arguments, the fate of Will Nix was in the jury's hands. They had to decide whether Will Nix masterminded Sal Rossetti's murder, or if Paul Gonzalez acted on his own in an attempt to impress his fast-living boss. After spending 8 days listening to testimony, the jury took 4 hours to reach a verdict.
Find the defendant, William Wayne.
The jury found William Wayne Nix Jr. guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree. The jury also convicted Nix of special circumstances, commission of a murder for financial gain, and using a firearm in the commission of a crime. Will Nix was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. He will live in Pelican Bay State Prison until the day he dies. Although the criminal trial was over, Sal Rossetti's family brought a wrongful death civil suit against Nix.
I was actually called as a witness in that lawsuit, and the end result was the Rossettis were awarded $2.2 million against Nix.
But Nix anticipated the civil suit and dispersed his assets. To date, the Rossetti family has not received any of the money from the lawsuit. As for the other conspirators, Rocky Holton, Nix's mechanic, eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received the maximum sentence, 11 years. Paul Gonzalez Jr. was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his role. Paul Gonzalez Sr. faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Because of his cooperation, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Albert Vargas received the same sentence, 20 years. Joseph Smith, who admitted being an accessory after the fact, received 3 years. The alleged shooter, Jose Tonto Miranda, is still at large and wanted for murder. The Rossetti family still hopes that one day he will be brought to justice. An aspiring producer comes to Los Angeles from New York to break into the movie business. Within months, an unidentified body is found in the desert outside LA. The mysterious death leads investigators to a ring of professional killers, a movie-making legend, and a missing shipment of Colombian cocaine. A team of hitmen commit what they believe is a perfect murder. When the highly publicized case comes to trial, prosecutor David Kahn will lead the fight to bring the killers to justice.
We were dealing with very dangerous individuals, and I felt it was absolutely necessary to convict them and send them to prison for the rest of their lives.
Late one night in the spring of 1983, a man and a woman walked out of a Los Angeles hotel and stepped into a rented limousine. As they pulled away from the curb, a black sedan followed close behind. The two vehicles moved through the streets for several blocks. When the driver of the limousine pulled into a parking lot, a well-planned operation quickly unfolded. Armed with automatic weapons, the men in the sedan slipped into the limousine. The limo's female passenger took control of the sedan. The male passenger was held at gunpoint. The chauffeur resumed his position behind the wheel and quietly maneuvered the limousine out of the parking lot. Kidnapped, the passenger was driven to a remote desert area about an hour's drive north of the city. Under the cover of night, the man was pulled out of the limousine. As he begged for mercy, he was dragged from the car into the darkness. The man was shot at point-blank range over a dozen times. On June 10th, 1 month later, a California forest ranger and a local beekeeper were scouting locations for commercial beehives in Caswell Canyon, about 60 miles north of Los Angeles. The beekeeper spotted a body, shrunken and leathered by the desert sun, and clothed in a three-piece suit. The ranger reported the find to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Detective Carlos Avila responded to the scene of the crime.
Well, once we got there, we found an individual that appeared to be a male, rather tall, appeared to have been large at one time, dressed in a nice suit, tie, and loafers, rather expensive clothing. And he had been mummified. He'd been apparently out in the desert for quite a while. It appeared to have several gunshots to the back of the head.
The lower part of the victim's face was missing. There was no identification found on the body. Concerned that identification of the body would be difficult, detectives questioned the park ranger and the beekeeper. The park ranger told detectives the area was a popular target shooting location.
Oh, absolutely.
Detectives found that the dry sand was littered with spent gun shells from handguns, rifles, and semi-automatics. Then, about 8 feet from the body, investigators found the fragments of a jawbone. If this bone belonged to the body, it could provide a clue to the identity of the victim and perhaps help tell the story of his mysterious murder. The Los Angeles medical examiner told investigators that the victim had been dead for approximately 1 month. The victim's body had been struck by 13 .22 caliber bullets. He determined the jaw fragment belonged to the corpse and suggested it had been separated from the head by animal activity. The death was ruled a homicide.
See right there.
Investigators reviewed hundreds of missing persons reports. They soon found a possible match. A 33-year-old East Coast vaudeville revival promoter named Roy Radin had been reported missing by his assistant about a month earlier. Investigators obtained the missing man's dental records from his family in New York. When the medical examiner compared the records with the dental remains of the victim, he determined that they were a match. Los Angeles detectives immediately flew to New York. They arrived at a Manhattan hotel, and in an office suite belonging to the murder victim, they were met by the man who had filed the missing persons report. Jonathan Lawson was Roy Radin's former assistant.
When was the last time that you saw Roy, sir?
He explained that in New York, Radin had been a successful producer of vaudeville revival acts and had recently gone to Hollywood to launch a movie career. Lawson said he last saw his employer on the night of May 13th. He said Radin left their hotel with a woman named Laney Jacobs. They were supposed to go to dinner to discuss a movie deal. Lawson never saw his friend and boss again.
He didn't want to be seen.
Lawson told investigators that Laney Jacobs was not really a player in the movie business.
He knew something was up. She has these crony friends of hers.
She was a major cocaine dealer. Most of her customers were in the movie industry, and Lawson said she was one of the first people Radin met when he arrived in Los Angeles several months earlier. Lawson told investigators that during their Los Angeles business trips, Radin often sent him to pick up drugs from Laney. According to Lawson, Radin believed that with her connections, she could be his entree into the movie business. Lawson explained that Radin had recently bought the rights to a musical about New York's famed Cotton Club, a Harlem speakeasy in the 1920s.
You haven't seen anything yet. What you think? This.
Lawson told investigators that Laney told Radin she could introduce him to Robert Evans, who had produced The Godfather and Chinatown. Lawson said Evans liked Radin's idea for the Cotton Club movie. According to Lawson, Evans told Radin that he had been working on a similar idea, and they made a verbal agreement to form a partnership. Lawson told detectives that as the movie deal progressed, Laney and Radin's friendship began to turn sour.
She and her friends wanted me to do.
Lawson told the investigators that a financial disagreement was to be the subject of the meeting between Laney and Radin on the last night he saw his boss alive.
And I'm not there.
Lawson was convinced that Jacobs had something to do with Radin's death.
I just have this feeling that I'm next.
The detectives returned to Los Angeles to follow up on the information Lawson had given them. They visited Laney Jacobs' home. No one answered the door. The house appeared to have been vacated. Detectives soon learned the property had been put on the market on March 12th, the day before Roy Radin disappeared.
My name is John Lucas. I'm the attorney.
A few days after returning from New York, the detectives were visited by Laney Jacobs' attorney. He provided an alibi for Jacobs on the night that Radin was reported missing, producing phone records that showed she was in Los Angeles that night and nowhere near the murder scene at Caswell Canyon.
I believe you'll find all the answers you need.
The attorney told detectives that unless they placed his client under arrest, she would not agree to an interview or answer any of their questions.
You have a great day.
Detectives next contacted producer Robert Evans, who agreed to talk to them at his Beverly Hills home. Evans' attorney also attended the meeting. According to investigators, Evans said that Radin had convinced a group of Puerto Rican businessmen to invest $35 million in a three-picture deal, including the Cotton Club. But as the deal moved forward, Laney Jacobs demanded half of Roy Radin's share in the partnership. Evans told investigators that Radin turned Laney down. He offered her a one-time payment of $50,000. When they could not agree, the signing of the deal was postponed. Convinced they had discovered a possible motive for the murder, investigators continued to search for clues to what happened on the night Roy Radin disappeared. Detectives next tracked down Laney Jacobs' chauffeur. They found the driver as he was reporting to work. He said that on the day Roy Radin disappeared, he had driven Laney's infant son and the nanny to the airport. The chauffeur said the child and nanny had plane tickets for Mexico. He told detectives he saw two suspicious men when he arrived at Jacobs' house. The driver said he noticed one of the men had handcuffs attached to his belt. He asked if Laney was in trouble, but the nanny assured him their boss was fine. The driver said that he did not drive Laney or Radin on the night that Radin disappeared. Detectives learned that a limousine rented from another company had been used by Laney Jacobs and Roy Radin that night.
Okay, well, thank you for your time. We may get back to you later on.
The owner of the limousine company told detectives that he had rented a limousine to one of Laney's bodyguards, a man named Bill Menser, on the night Radin disappeared. According to the owner, Menser refused a staff driver and had provided his own chauffeur. Detectives obtained a warrant and conducted a forensic search of the limousine rented by Menser. Technicians analyzed the car for blood, hair, and fiber trace evidence and checked for fingerprints. Not a single piece of microscopic evidence was found linking the car to the victim. Detective Avila soon made an unsettling discovery.
We obtained a search warrant for that vehicle. They found nothing of evidence, but then we found out that the entire inside of the vehicle had been changed after the murder. They'd reupholstered the interior, the headliner, the rugs, and everything else, and then they put the car for sale.
Detectives learned that Laney's bodyguard and the man who had rented the limousine, Bill Menser, had recently been arrested for suspicion of intent to distribute narcotics. Before he was released, detectives interviewed Menser. Claiming to have no knowledge of Radin's murder, Menser agreed to allow the police to search his Los Angeles home. Menser himself was not present when police searched his apartment.
Hey, Carlos.
Detectives found a collection of photographs which would provide an important lead in the case. The photographs depicted Menser accompanied by several heavily armed men posing for a camera in a remote desert area. In looking closely at the photographs, Detective Avila observed that the background in the photos seemed to match the terrain of the area where Radin's body was recovered.
Well, I later went back to the location where this photograph, what I thought maybe the photograph was taken, where we had found the body of Roy Radin. And you could see the skyline matched perfectly where this area was.
Despite the suggestive nature of the images, investigators still could not make an arrest.
Let's see what we have here, sir.
To keep alive the hope of obtaining justice for the murder of Roy Radin, it would take the efforts of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department's cold case unit and the persistence of a determined prosecutor. The body of aspiring movie producer Roy Radin was found decomposing in a remote canyon 60 miles north of Los Angeles in June of 1983. Police had suspects, but no hard evidence in the case. With no new evidence coming in, the Roy Radin murder case soon went cold. Robert Evans, who had been in discussions with Radin about a possible movie deal, found new investors and went on to produce The Cotton Club, which premiered in 1984 amid mediocre reviews. After 4 years, the Roy Radin murder case found its way to the desk of Assistant District Attorney David Kahn. Studying the case, he knew the odds were against the authorities.
We did have a suspicion of the persons involved, but there was no hard evidence at all to begin with. And I was very doubtful, to be honest with you, that we might ever put the case together, because if a case is not solved shortly after the time of the crime, there's a good chance that it will never be solved.
Radin's family in New York continued to call and write letters to Los Angeles police and prosecutors, urging them not to give up. Roy's sister Kate spoke to David Kahn.
Roy was a very persistent type of man, so maybe I've got some of that from him. But I knew that I had to stand up for Roy, and I knew that I needed justice to just get on with my life.
Prosecutor Kahn assured Kate that the case would not be forgotten. He would send it to the Cold Case Division of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Passing the files to the Cold Case Division would give the investigation new life. It was now in the hands of two of the most experienced detectives in the department. Detective Charlie Gunther, credited with breaking open the Charles Manson case, and Sergeant Bill Stoner, a 30-year veteran. Detective Stoner knew that now, years after the murder, time was on his side.
The thing that we had going for us is that the case at that point was 4 years old, and people's lives began to change. And people who would not talk to you back in 1983 suddenly are now living in another state, or they're raising children and they've got a job now, and suddenly they were willing to talk to us, and that's really what started putting the case together.
The strategy was to interview people on the periphery of the case. Detective Stoner didn't want any possible suspects knowing the Radin murder investigation had been reactivated.
usually there's nobody better than an ex-spouse, whether it be a male or female. And so we made arrangements to interview Bill Mentzer's ex-wife. They were still married at the time the homicide occurred.
We'd like to
Debbie
talk to you
Jacobs,
about,
no relation to Laney Jacobs, was the ex-wife of Bill
I'd
Mentzer.
like to show you some pictures and see if
Mentzer
you
had
can
worked for Laney
recognize
Jacobs as a bodyguard.
anybody that went out there.
Detectives showed Debbie the photographs found in Mentzer's apartment. Debbie pointed out her ex-husband, Bill Mentzer. 4 years earlier, her husband had refused to give detectives the names of the other two men in the photographs. Now, Debbie Jacobs revealed their identities.
Oh, one turned out to be Alex Marty. That's the first time his name even came into the investigation. And the other person was Bill Ryder.
Jacobs told Detective Stoner that Alex Marty was a dangerous and violent man. But she said the other man in the picture, Bill Ryder, was not a criminal. He was an ex-policeman, the brother-in-law of Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flint. She said Ryder used to run Flint's security and had hired her ex-husband and Marty as bodyguards for Flint. Debbie Jacobs gave detectives Bill Ryder's address and phone number in the Midwest.
All right, Mrs. Jacobs, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ryder flew to an airport outside of Los Angeles and met with detectives. He had agreed to help in the investigation and would take Stoner to a place he knew as Mentzer's favorite target shooting spot. Ryder took the investigators to Caswell Canyon. He showed them the same area Detective Avila had identified through the Mentzer photographs. The same area where Radin's body had been found 4 years earlier. But now, 4 years later, Ryder gave detectives some new information.
All right.
He told investigators that Mentzer, Marty, and a third man, Robert Lowe, had boasted about the Radin murder. Journalist Steve Wick wrote a book on the Roy Radin case.
Ryder knew Mentzer and Marty and knew about the murder and heard from them what had happened. Bill Ryder had briefly worked for Larry Flint too, where Mentzer and Marty had worked, and he knew what kind of people they were. These were really violent people.
Detectives finally had a witness. They told Ryder it was imperative that they obtain a tape recording of Mentzer and the killers talking about the murder. They asked Ryder to help by visiting the suspects and wearing a wire. He refused. He told detectives that these men were killers. He feared for his family's safety.
Bill Ryder was very reluctant to get involved in this investigation because he was very much concerned about his own safety. He knew that some of the men involved in this murder were the type of men who would have no hesitation to kill him as well.
Letting go of Ryder for the moment, the investigators moved on to their next witness. Back in Los Angeles, detectives caught up with Laney Jacobs' former secretary, Anna Montenegro. Montenegro had briefly dated Roy Radin. Montenegro told detectives that in March of 1983, just a few weeks after Laney and Radin had their disagreement about the Cotton Club deal, Laney came home one afternoon and discovered that someone had broken into a secret safe in her garage and stolen $275,000 in cash and 10 kilos of cocaine, worth about $750,000. She was convinced her drug courier had stolen the money and drugs. Montenegro was visiting Roy Radin's Los Angeles apartment when his assistant took a call from Laney. Laney was hysterical. She accused Roy of participating in the theft of her drugs and money. She knew that Radin and her drug courier were friends. She demanded to know where the courier was hiding. Radin claimed that he knew nothing about the theft, and he didn't know where the courier was. Laney was terrified, Montenegro said, because the stolen drugs and the money belonged to Laney's Colombian supplier. She couldn't cover the debt, and she expected the Colombians to seek swift revenge. Investigators were convinced that the theft of the cocaine and the money showed that Laney Jacobs had sufficient motive to murder Roy Radin. But detectives still did not have the direct evidence a prosecutor would need to prove the crime in court. Now, investigators could only hope that Bill Ryder would agree to help them get that evidence.
David?
Detective Stoner had kept in close contact with Ryder. After months of negotiations, the ex-cop finally agreed to help. Assured of his family's safety, he would wear a wire and try to engage the bodyguards in conversation about the Radin murder. In June of 1988, more than 5 years after the murder, Ryder and the detectives went to Maryland, where Robert Lowe, one of the suspects, was working as a bartender. They launched a wiretap operation with the help of Maryland State Police. Bill Ryder walked into the bar, and as agents listened and a recorder taped the conversation, he started to talk with Lowe.
Looks like you're working hard.
Yeah.
Ryder was able to get Lowe to talk about the part he played in Radin's murder.
It has been a long time. You been with Bill on a homicide? Never have. That stupid jerk gets drunk.
Would I have told you? Would I have told you if I had? I know about yours though.
Go ahead.
He was talking about Radin. He said you were afraid, real afraid on that one.
It isn't true, and I don't believe what
He did say it. He did say that.
I was.
You drove the car.
Investigators now had Robert Lowe admitting on tape that he was present during the shooting of Roy Radin.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, I know you drove.
Their next target would be Bill Menser. The investigators returned to Los Angeles. They placed surveillance devices in Bill Ryder's hotel room, set up their headquarters in the room next door, and Ryder called Menser, told him he was in town on a job, and asked him to come over for a drink.
Let's watch a little
Menser
TV,
accepted the invitation. Investigators monitored the meeting from an adjacent hotel room. Menser was nervous, and he kept turning on the television so their conversation wouldn't be overheard.
No. You know what? Alex is full of crap. I'm the one that planned that whole thing.
Yes. He said he lost a lot of respect for you that night because you had to get drunk to finish the job.
On the tape, Ryder teased Menser about losing his nerve.
Work beautifully, they do.
Cold case investigators now had tape recordings of two hitmen incriminating themselves in the murder of Roy Radin.
Because, you know, I like to drink a little.
The next step would be to go after the third hitman and the woman suspected of ordering the murder, Laney Jacobs. In 1988, 5 years after the murder of Roy Radin, suspect Laney Jacobs was living in the town of Okeechobee, Florida. Investigators learned that she had married Larry Greenberger, a man known to Florida police as one of the top cocaine distributors in the U.S. Journalist Steve Wick.
And Larry Greenberger is really one of these amazing characters that comes along every once in a while. Larry was from Okeechobee, Florida, a very small town. Larry got into the cocaine business when the cocaine business was kind of loose and unorganized, and he became a distributor for Carlos later, probably the biggest Colombian who ever was in the business.
Laney was now masquerading as a wealthy housewife, dividing her time between homes in Florida and Colorado with her new husband and 6-year-old son. In mid-August, Bill Ryder told investigators that he'd received a phone call from Bill Menser.
I heard it from one of my sources.
He said Laney's husband had committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. At first, Detective Stoner thought the information was a trap.
And we thought maybe they're trying to find out who we're getting our information from, and they're just feeding this information to Ryder. And then if somebody calls and inquires back in Okeechobee about Larry Greenberger being killed, they say, no, he wasn't killed. Then they'll know who's given us our information.
The Los Angeles detectives confirmed that Greenberger had died. They also learned that Florida investigators found evidence the suicide was a murder. And Laney and a male friend were the prime suspects. Gunpowder residue on the body indicated the bullets were fired from 6 to 8 feet away. Larry Greenberger could not possibly have shot himself. Investigators and prosecutors knew they had to move fast. Police in Florida set up a meeting with Laney at an Orlando motel. They assured her they just wanted to ask her a few questions about her husband's death. But when she and her male friend walked into the meeting, she was handed an arrest warrant for the murder of Roy Raden.
I have a warrant for your arrest.
Laney was stunned. Nearly 5 years had passed since the murder of Roy Raden. Prosecutor David Kahn finally had the prime suspect in police custody.
I think that Laney Greenberger was very much surprised when the arrests were made in this case, once again because so much time had elapsed, and I think that they felt that they had covered their trail pretty well. They were, all in all, a very professional and well-financed group of people.
Laney was brought back to Los Angeles, where she was arraigned and charged with murder. She was held without bail. Menser and Marty, two of Laney's former bodyguards, were also arrested, charged with murder, and held without bail. Robert Lowe, another bodyguard, was the fourth suspect arrested.
Yes.
Armed with the two suspects' taped conversations with Bill Ryder, David Kahn was ready to prosecute. He brought on 8-year veteran prosecutor Sally Thomas as his partner, telling her it would be a challenging case.
It was a publicity case. There were a lot of evidence, a lot of witnesses. There was a lot of evidence, and he needed help.
The first task for the prosecutors would be to organize the thousands of pages of crime reports and witness and surveillance tape transcripts turned over by the investigators.
But I think generally most lawyers do what we did, and that is to try to start at the beginning in terms of the evidence and have the story unfold as it did in actuality in 1983 when the crime occurred.
At the pretrial hearing, the prosecutor's first strategy was to get movie producer Robert Evans to testify in court. Evans had been working with Laney and Raden to fund his comeback project, the Cotton Club. The prosecutors wanted Evans to testify about the financial disagreement between Laney and Raden, to prove that she had motive to kill him.
Mr. Evans, did you know a man by the name of Roy Raden?
Sir, on advice of my counsel, I refuse to answer the question.
Evans' lawyer, Robert Shapiro, refused to allow his client to testify unless he was given immunity.
Very well.
based on Evidence Code 944.
In a defeat for the prosecution, the judge agreed that under the U.S. Constitution's protections against self-incrimination, Evans did not have to testify.
Bob Shapiro wanted immunity for Bob Evans up front, and that's not how we do it in the district attorney's office. First, we take a statement from the person and find out what they have to say, and then sometimes give immunity based upon that offer. In this case, Bob Shapiro was unwilling to go along with that procedure, and I told him I would not give Bob Evans immunity under those circumstances.
The prosecutors would have to go to trial without Evans' testimony, which they believed could have helped them put Laney Jacobs behind bars. 2 of the 4 suspects had deep pockets. The prosecutors would face their army of lawyers who would launch multiple battles over the wiretaps and the witnesses every step of the way. The execution-style murder of Roy Radin had been an unsolved mystery in Los Angeles for years.
Listen to what happens in court. This case is
The trial of the 4 suspects in the case was much anticipated by the news media and the movie business alike. The story had all the makings of a big screen drama. The victim, a Hollywood newcomer, murdered just as he was on the verge of becoming a success.
All rise.
Defense lawyers argued to try the defendants separately, but prosecutors knew in separate trials each might successfully blame the other.
Mr. Khan, dismiss ourselves here. I want to remind you of the terms in
And the first win for the prosecution came when the judge ruled that the defendants be tried together.
It is important to try all 4 defendants together so that if there is any finger pointing, they ultimately convict each other, or if they don't point the finger at each other, the jury will also commonly assume that they were all in it together.
Place your left hand on the Bible, raise your right.
The success of the prosecution's case would depend almost entirely on the testimony of their star witness, Bill Ryder, and his tape-recorded conversations with defendants Menser and Lowe.
Mr. Ryder, the jury is being given some transcriptions of some surveillance tapes. I'd like to ask Mr. Ryder some questions about those tapes. Mr. Ryder.
On the stand, Ryder recounted his conversations with Menser and Lowe about the murder plot. The jury, given transcripts of Ryder's taped conversations, began to get a picture of what was the beginning of the end for Roy Radin.
Dealings with Roy Radin?
Yes, he did go into some detail about some business activities he was doing with Mr. Radin.
Ryder told the court that Menser, who was having an affair with Laney while working as her bodyguard, once told him that the murder was retribution for the stolen drugs.
1983.
He told us that they were out for a long drive in Hollywood, and
Ryder told the jury that Menser bragged about planning the crime. Bob Lowe would drive the limousine with Laney and Roy in the back seat. Menser and Alex Marty would follow in another car. According to Ryder, both cars stopped a few miles away from the hotel. Menser and Marty climbed into the limo, guns drawn on Roy Radin. Laney got out and drove the second car away, and the limo headed north out of town.
And they were being pursued by a police car, thought they were going to be pulled over.
Ryder recounted how Menser told him that at one point, the men saw flashing police lights and thought the game was up. One put a gun in Radin's face and the other a gun in his groin to keep him silent. But the police sirens passed them on to another call. Prosecutor Sally Thomas.
Menser talks about that trip on the surveillance tape, and it's pretty chilling when you hear him talk about what he did to Roy Radin, how they dealt with him, and what Marty did to him on his way out to Caswell Canyon, and that must have been a pretty horrifying ride for Roy Radin.
Once they were out of the city and into the darkness of Caswell Canyon, Ryder testified that Mentzer said Marty went crazy, shooting Radin 13 times because it was Friday the 13th.
Cross-examination at this time. Defense have any questions?
Yeah, sure.
Defense attorneys tried to discredit Bill Ryder by claiming that he had been paid a monthly stipend for his testimony.
Your testimony that the $3,000 is for your security expenses?
It was for what I said, living expenses. It was only partial payment. My own expenses are a lot more than what I get from the county.
The taped admissions of kidnapping and murder by the defendants might have been discounted as drinking stories.
Ms. Thomas?
But prosecutors had another witness to corroborate the evidence. Another of Mentzer's bodyguard friends, Carl Polzak. During their investigation, Los Angeles homicide detectives had identified and questioned Polzak, a professional bodyguard and friend of Bill Mentzer.
I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
Please be seated.
Polzak was an eyewitness to the planning, but was not involved in the murder at Caswell Canyon.
What was it that he said?
Given immunity by the prosecutors, he agreed to testify.
Bob was going to dress up like a chauffeur and drive the car.
Polzak told the court that on May 13th, the day of Radin's murder, Mentzer held a planning session at his home.
All right, look, here's the way it's going to play out. Lo and Laney are going to be in the
Polzak said the plan was to kidnap Radin and make him tell where the stolen drug money
at an
was,
appropriate time in the road, you stop
and to locate the missing drug courier.
There's a picture of Lawson on the refrigerator.
Mr. Polzak said that he was involved in the planning of the kidnap of Roy Radin. There was no discussion of murder at that meeting, but nevertheless he was able to testify that it was very clear that the three bodyguards were going to kidnap Roy Radin that evening, so he was able to make the case against each of them.
Somewhere along the line,
Polzak told prosecutors he was to kidnap Radin's assistant, Jonathan Lawson. But that night, Lawson had chosen to remain at the hotel.
Because that fell through, he was never charged with a crime, and so we were able to use Mr. Polzak as a witness in this case.
Laney was going to get out. Bill and Alex were going to get in and grab the producer.
It was Polzak's testimony that revealed the final cruelty to Roy Radin after he was shot to death.
They called him the fat pig.
When they discovered the body, investigators suspected that the victim's jaw had been removed by animal activity. Polzak, however, testified that after Radin was shot, the killers had planned to put a quarter stick of dynamite in his mouth and explode his face to prevent identification by police.
May counsel approach the bench, Your Honor?
The courtroom atmosphere was becoming tense because of the high-level drug connections of the suspects. Undercover cops were placed in the gallery to protect prosecution witnesses, and defense lawyers requested additional security for themselves.
We had sheriff's deputies in the courtroom. We had plainclothes people, sitting in the audience. Probably the most frightened I've been in any case, and I'm not going to elaborate, but I will mention that at least on one occasion my home was surveilled for much of a day. And so those kinds of things that were pretty nerve-wracking and frightening in that respect.
But the leading lady, Laney Jacobs Greenberger, remained cool and optimistic.
Laney Greenberger, Your Honor.
She was either a ruthless drug dealer or a powerless party girl caught in the violence of her drug lord masters. Soon, she would have her own say on the witness stand. In late April 1991, the prosecution rested its case against the 4 defendants accused of killing Roy Radin. Of the 4 defendants, only Laney Jacobs Greenberger chose to take the stand in her own defense.
When you say you were here to
She told the court that she never wanted Radin killed, but that things were completely out of her
The money
control.
had to go back to count the money. In fact, he's the one you should be talking to. It was his coke that was stolen from the garage, not mine.
She said the man pulling the strings was her Florida drug connection, a man named Milan Belachasis.
Because of that, I was under a lot of...
She said that she and Belachasis were partners in their drug operation. But when the cocaine and money were stolen from her home in Sherman Oaks, Belachasis demanded retribution. He threatened her life, she said, and he had ordered Bill Menser to kill Radin. Laney testified that she had hoped to make enough money from the Cotton Club deal to repay her drug boss.
I was under a lot of pressure.
She made mistakes in her life.
Radin, she said, had promised her a share in the movie profits, but later reneged. She said that on the night of May 13th, the night Radin disappeared, she was in a limousine with him discussing the movie deal. Without warning, she testified, the limousine stopped and Bill Menser jumped in, telling her to get out of the car.
I never thought anyone would be harmed. No one had ever been harmed.
She said she didn't know Radin was killed until Menser told her the next day.
Bill Ryder. The overwhelming.
When her attorney asked her why she hadn't reported the murder to police, she said it was because she didn't want to reveal her drug dealing activities.
Prosecution, have any questions?
Yes, Your Honor.
On cross-examination, the prosecution challenged Laney's claim that she needed the movie profits to repay her debt to Belachasis. She admitted that she had the money to pay back the debt, but she claimed that she couldn't afford to pay it back all at once. Laney described a meeting she had with Bill Menser. She said Menser agreed to kidnap Radin and force him to tell where the courier was, so they could recover the drugs and money. Murder, she said, was the last thing she expected.
Those are the instructions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
The trial lasted for 8 months.
You can retire. The jury room.
After hearing closing arguments from each defendant's lawyer, it was time for the jury to make its decision.
Until that time, court's in recess.
The prosecutors were asking for first-degree murder for all four, a verdict that could lead to the death penalty. Journalist Steve Wick covered the trial.
And Laney Jacobs, I'm convinced to this day, was certain she would be acquitted. Everything had gone her way for years. She had used enough people, made enough money, gotten her way enough times, had enough temper tantrums to get her own way that I think she thought she'd paid a lot of money for a lawyer. This is not me. No one could possibly believe that I could do this.
Laney was confident enough to tell a bailiff she would be going home soon. And privately, the prosecutors worried that might indeed be true.
We had a great case against Menser. We had a great case against Lowe based on the surveillance tapes, but we had a much weaker case on Greenberger and Marty.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Bailiff.
The jury deliberated for 2 weeks. Finally, the jurors sent word to the judge that they were ready to announce their decision.
We, the jury, find William Maloney Menser guilty of first-degree murder.
In the end, the jury found Bill Menser and Alex Marty guilty of first-degree murder, and found Laney Jacobs Greenberger and Bob Lowe guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. All four were also found guilty of kidnapping resulting in death, a charge which carries a mandatory life sentence. Laney Jacobs Greenberger and her 3 hired hitmen are now serving life without parole in California prisons.